What if I told you that one of the world's most trusted car brands built its empire on a lie? That the cars millions proudly drove, marketed as clean diesel, praised as eco-friendly, and celebrated as engineering marvels, were secretly engineered to cheat the system and poison the air we breathe. This wasn't a small oversight. This was a calculated fraud worth $30 billion, a scheme so elaborate it fooled governments, regulators, scientists, and everyday drivers for years. And it all came from a company whose name was once synonymous with honesty, precision, and German excellence: Volkswagen. This scandal, now infamous as Dieselgate, wasn't just a black eye for one automaker, it was a betrayal on a global scale. At its heart was a single, sinister invention, the so-called defeat device. Hidden deep within millions of Volkswagen diesel cars, this tiny piece of software had one job: to detect when the vehicle was being tested in a lab. In those carefully controlled moments, the car would transform into an environmental angel, keeping emissions clean and within the strict limits regulators demanded. But the moment the car returned to the real world, away from the lab equipment and testing stations, that angel vanished and the devil revealed itself. Instead of running clean, these engines spewed toxic nitrogen oxides up to 40 times higher than the legal limit. That's not just a number on paper, that's pollution linked to smog, asthma, lung disease, and thousands of premature deaths. Volkswagen didn't just bend the rules. They shattered them while selling drivers the dream of a guilt-free, environmentally friendly car. And the most chilling part? They almost got away with it. For years, no one questioned the miracle of Volkswagen's clean diesel. Regulators were satisfied, consumers were delighted. Advertisements bragged about being both powerful and planet-friendly. The company rose higher and higher, its diesel cars winning awards, its reputation polished as the automaker that could combine performance with responsibility. But beneath the glossy ads and polished speeches, the lie was running silently in millions of engines worldwide. The truth didn't come from Volkswagen's conscience, it came from a handful of outsiders who stumbled on numbers that didn't add up. Independent researchers, tasked with checking emissions in real driving conditions, were baffled. Why were Volkswagen cars spewing far more pollution on the road than in the lab? At first, it seemed like a technical hiccup, but as the tests piled up, suspicion turned into certainty. Something wasn't right. And when investigators finally pressed Volkswagen for answers, the company didn't come clean. Instead, they stalled, denied, and scrambled, trying to contain a secret that was quickly slipping out of their control. What happened next would unravel Volkswagen's carefully constructed empire, expose top executives, and unleash lawsuits, criminal charges, and billions in fines. But the bigger question still hangs in the air. Why would one of the world's most respected automakers gamble its entire legacy on such a reckless scheme? To understand why Volkswagen took such a dangerous gamble, we need to step behind the curtain into the boardrooms, the rivalries, and the relentless pressures that shaped the modern auto industry. At the time, Volkswagen had an obsession. It wanted to dominate the US market. For decades, the brand had been seen as European, efficient, reliable, but it was never able to fully conquer America the way Toyota, Ford, or Honda had. The Americans loved big trucks, powerful SUVs, and reliable sedans. Toyota had already captured hearts with hybrids like the Prius, a car that symbolized eco-conscious driving. Volkswagen, meanwhile, was struggling to stand out. They needed something bold, something unique that would give them an edge, and they thought they had the perfect answer: clean diesel. Volkswagen poured billions into marketing diesel as the miracle fuel, promising drivers the holy grail: strong performance, great fuel economy, and low emissions. It was pitched as better than hybrids, cleaner than gasoline, and more fun to drive than Toyota's Prius. In glossy commercials, smiling families drove VW diesels under blue skies, the slogan Das Auto echoing a promise of trust and innovation. To regulators, Volkswagen presented itself as the champion of European engineering, ready to meet America's tough environmental standards while still giving drivers the torque and power they loved. But behind those promises, there was a growing problem. Meeting the strict US emissions standards without sacrificing performance wasn't as easy as Volkswagen claimed. Engineers struggled to balance fuel economy, engine power, and emissions. Time and again, the technology fell short, and with deadlines looming, billions already invested, and executives demanding results, Volkswagen's leadership faced a choice: admit failure and lose face, or cheat. And here's where the story darkens. Instead of pulling back, Volkswagen doubled down. They didn't just bend under pressure, they created a solution that was, in its own twisted way, brilliant. The defeat device wasn't a sloppy patch, it was sophisticated, hidden deep within the software, smart enough to detect, test conditions, and flip a switch between clean mode and road mode. To Volkswagen's leadership, it was the perfect illusion. Nobody would know, the cars would pass every test, and the company could finally claim its spot at the top of the US market. But arrogance played a role too. Volkswagen wasn't just desperate, they were confident that regulators would never catch on. After all, emissions testing had weaknesses. Most agencies relied heavily on lab tests, not real-world driving. For Volkswagen, the risk felt small compared to the reward. Billions in profits, a stronger global reputation, and the glory of finally beating rivals like Toyota and Honda. Wasn't that worth a little hidden code? What they didn't count on was how quickly that arrogance would turn into their downfall. Because while Volkswagen thought they had engineered the perfect cover-up, cracks were already beginning to form. At the heart of Dieselgate wasn't just a clever piece of software, it was a culture. Volkswagen wasn't any ordinary company. Inside its headquarters in Wolfsburg, Germany, the atmosphere was described by insiders as intensely hierarchical, secretive, and ruthless. Decisions flowed from the top down, and questioning authority was rarely tolerated. Engineers and mid-level managers didn't simply report progress. They reported success, whether or not the success was real. This pressure cooker environment started at the very top. Volkswagen's leadership, particularly under former CEO Martin Winterkorn, was notorious for demanding perfection. Winterkorn was described as brilliant but merciless, a man with an eye for detail so sharp he could spot a flaw in a prototype just by glancing at it. But his demand for excellence wasn't just about craftsmanship, it was about results. If engineers came to him with excuses or setbacks, they risked humiliation, demotion, or worse. The message was clear: failure was not an option. That culture trickled down through every level of the company. Engineers tasked with meeting the impossible US emission standards were caught in a trap. On one side, there were the harsh realities of physics and engineering. It simply wasn't possible to build a diesel engine that delivered both the power and efficiency Volkswagen promised while staying within American emissions limits. On the other side, there was the unyielding demand from executives: deliver results, no matter what. So when the idea of a software solution emerged, it didn't feel like fraud to some, it felt like survival. In Volkswagen's rigid world, telling the truth was riskier than building the lie. And here's the darker truth: this wasn't just a technical fix. This was a decision that reflected the company's DNA. Volkswagen had long been driven by ambition bordering on obsession. For decades, it dreamed of overtaking Toyota as the world's largest automaker. Diesel was supposed to be the weapon that made it happen. Every commercial, every billboard, every talking point from Volkswagen's executives hammered the same message: clean diesel was the future. Admitting failure would have meant admitting that Volkswagen's entire strategy, the billions spent, the marketing campaigns, the reputation, was built on sand. Inside the company, few dared to question the scheme. Those who might have spoken up often faced isolation, ridicule, or career suicide. Engineers kept their heads down, managers looked the other way, and executives, perched at the top, convinced themselves that what they were doing wasn't really harming anyone, that it was just bending the rules, a temporary shortcut until they could figure out a real solution. But here's where arrogance transformed into delusion. Volkswagen wasn't just cheating quietly, they were boasting publicly. Ads declared their diesels cleaner than hybrids. Executives stood on stages, smiling in front of cameras, talking about their commitment to sustainability. All the while, millions of cars were secretly pumping out toxic gases at levels so high they endangered public health. It wasn't just deception, it was hypocrisy on a global stage. And yet, inside Volkswagen, the lie became normal. The defeat device wasn't seen as a crime, it was seen as innovation, a clever trick, a way to keep the dream alive a little longer. But outside those walls, cracks were forming, and it was only a matter of time before the illusion would shatter. For years, Volkswagen's deception seemed untouchable. The company's diesels sailed through official lab tests, won awards, and gained glowing reviews from automotive journalists. Customers were convinced they had found the perfect balance between performance and eco-friendliness. Regulators checked their boxes and moved on. The leak was airtight at least on the surface, but the first cracks didn't come from rival car companies or even government watchdogs. They came from a small, underfunded group of researchers who weren't even looking for fraud. In 2013, the International Council on Clean Transportation, a nonprofit dedicated to studying emissions, partnered with researchers at West Virginia University to test diesel cars on American roads. Their mission was simple: to prove that European diesels, like Volkswagen's, were clean enough to meet US standards. Ironically, their work was supposed to help the diesel industry's reputation. What they found, however, was baffling. When tested in real-world driving conditions, Volkswagen's diesels were releasing nitrogen oxides not just slightly higher than legal limits, but in some cases 30 to 40 times higher. These weren't tiny discrepancies, they were massive, undeniable red flags. At first, the researchers thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe the equipment was faulty. Maybe the driving conditions weren't fair, but as they repeated the tests, the pattern held. Something was very, very wrong. They compiled their findings and brought them to US regulators, specifically the Environmental Protection Agency (EPA) and the California Air Resources Board (CARB). The data was impossible to ignore, but also hard to believe. Could a company as large and prestigious as Volkswagen really be cheating on such a scale? Regulators confronted Volkswagen, expecting a technical explanation, and that's when the cover-up began to unravel. Volkswagen's response was slippery. They insisted the discrepancies were due to technical issues or quirks in how the engines handled real-world driving. They offered recalls, software updates, and reassurances that everything was under control behind closed doors. However, executives were scrambling. They knew the truth, but admitting it meant detonating a bomb under the entire company. Still, the numbers didn't add up. The EPA and CARB pushed harder, demanding explanations. More tests were run, more inconsistencies appeared. The wall of lies Volkswagen had built for years was beginning to crack under the weight of undeniable evidence. And by 2015, the truth could no longer be contained. Volkswagen was cornered, and what happened next would turn a quiet investigation into a global scandal. By 2015, the walls were closing in. Volkswagen's explanations had worn thin, the recalls hadn't solved anything, and the regulators were no longer buying the story. The EPA and CARB pressed harder, running their own tests, digging deeper into the data and demanding transparency. Volkswagen, meanwhile, kept stalling, issuing vague promises, tweaking software, and quietly hoping the storm would pass. But the storm didn't pass. It grew. Every test confirmed the same truth: these cars were cheating. And eventually the deception became impossible to spin. Cornered, Volkswagen had no way out. On September 3, 2015, after months of pressure, the company finally admitted what it had denied for years. It had deliberately installed defeat devices in its diesel cars to cheat emissions tests. That moment detonated like a bomb overnight. Volkswagen went from one of the world's most admired automakers to the poster child for corporate deceit. Regulators around the globe launched investigations. News outlets splashed headlines of betrayal. Customers felt duped, angry that the cars they bought in good faith, the cars they believed were cleaner and greener, were actually polluting far more than advertised. The fallout was staggering. Volkswagen's stock price plunged nearly 40% in days, erasing billions in value. The company faced lawsuits from every direction: governments, environmental groups, angry consumers, and shareholders. Executives were forced to resign. Some faced criminal charges, and the financial cost? It kept climbing, eventually surpassing $30 billion in fines, settlements, and buybacks, making it one of the most expensive scandals in corporate history. But the damage wasn't just financial. The scandal shredded Volkswagen's reputation, not just in the US but worldwide. For decades, Volkswagen had sold itself as a symbol of German precision, quality, and trust. Das Auto, their proud slogan, now felt like a cruel joke. For millions, the name Volkswagen no longer meant innovation. It meant fraud. Yet behind the public outrage was something deeper, something regulators and activists pointed out again and again. This wasn't just about cheating tests. This was about people's health. By some estimates, the excess emissions from Volkswagen's diesels contributed to thousands of premature deaths worldwide. The scandal wasn't just corporate corruption, it was a crime with real victims. hidden in plain sight, and still, one haunting question lingered. How could a company of Volkswagen size, power, and prestige think it could lie to the entire world and get away with it? The confession was only the beginning. What followed was a tidal wave that reshaped not only Volkswagen, but the entire global auto industry. Regulators who had once trusted lab results suddenly realized they had been fooled, and not just by Volkswagen. If the world's biggest carmaker could cheat so boldly, who else might be bending the rules? Almost overnight, emissions testing underwent a revolution. Governments across Europe, the US, and Asia introduced real driving emissions tests, taking cars off the safe confines of the lab and measuring what they spewed into the air on real roads. Under real conditions, the days of easy loopholes and laboratory trickery were over. Diesel, once hailed as the clean, fuel-efficient alternative to gasoline, suddenly came under fire everywhere. For Volkswagen, the fallout was brutal. The company was forced to buy back hundreds of thousands of cars, pay billions in fines, and fund environmental cleanup projects. Showrooms that once proudly displayed clean diesel badges now stood as reminders of betrayal. Internally, executives scrambled to reinvent the company. The old dream of conquering the US market with diesel was dead. Volkswagen needed a new path forward. That path turned out to be electrification. In a twist of irony, Dieselgate became the catalyst for Volkswagen's massive pivot to electric vehicles. Under new leadership, the company pledged to invest tens of billions into EVs, vowing to leave the shadow of diesel behind and position itself as a leader in the future of green mobility. The very scandal that nearly destroyed Volkswagen also forced it to confront the future head-on, but the aftershocks didn't stop at Volkswagen's gates. Across Europe, cities began restricting diesel cars from entering their streets. Public trust in diesel collapsed. Competitors like BMW and Daimler were dragged into investigations of their own. The entire diesel industry, once the pride of Europe, began to crumble. And as the dust settled, one thing became clear: Dieselgate had sounded the death knell for diesel as the fuel of the future. Meanwhile, in courtrooms across the world, Volkswagen's leaders faced a reckoning. Some top executives were charged with fraud, conspiracy, and violating environmental laws. In Germany, investigations reached the highest levels of Volkswagen's leadership. In the US, prosecutors demanded accountability. And for the first time, the world saw auto executives in handcuffs, facing prison sentences for crimes that went far beyond the balance sheet. Yet, even with billions paid and reputations shattered, a haunting question still lingers. Was Dieselgate truly the act of one rogue company, or was it a symptom of something bigger? A culture of cutting corners, of chasing profit at any cost, of bending rules until they break? Because when one scandal this massive is exposed, it forces us to ask, how many others have simply not been caught? In the years that followed, Dieselgate stopped being just Volkswagen's scandal. It became a symbol of how fragile trust can be, how quickly reputations can collapse, and how the auto industry itself was standing at a crossroads. For decades, consumers believed that automakers had their best interests and the planet's best interests in mind. But after Dieselgate, doubt crept in. People began asking questions they hadn't asked before. If Volkswagen lied, who else is lying? Governments, too, were forced to confront their own complacency. For years, regulators had relied on lab tests designed more for convenience than for accuracy. Dieselgate exposed how easily those tests could be gamed, and how dangerously naive it was to trust automakers at their word. The result: sweeping reforms in emissions testing across Europe, the US, and Asia. Cars were no longer tested in sterile labs alone. They had to prove themselves on real streets, in real traffic, under real-world conditions. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Dieselgate wasn't about testing, or fines, or even Volkswagen itself. It was about the death of diesel and the birth of something new. Diesel had once been sold as the future, efficient, powerful, cleaner than gasoline. In Europe especially, diesel cars had dominated the roads. But after Volkswagen's fraud came to light, public trust in diesel collapsed almost overnight. Cities from Paris to Madrid announced restrictions or outright bans on diesel cars. Consumers began abandoning them in favor of hybrids and electric vehicles. And governments, eager to avoid another scandal, poured billions into EV incentives and stricter environmental laws. Volkswagen, ironically, became a leading force in that transformation. The same company that had poisoned its reputation with diesel began pouring unprecedented sums into electric mobility. Billions of euros went into building new EV platforms, new battery plants, and a bold new promise: Volkswagen would redeem itself not with diesel, but with electric cars that could finally deliver on the dream of clean driving without lies, without defeat devices. The ID.3, ID.4, and other EVs weren't just products, they were symbols of atonement, born from the ashes of Dieselgate. Yet, for all the progress, the shadow of Dieselgate still lingers.